Well, greetings everyone from the United Nations Refugee Agency. I've been especially honoured to have been asked to speak at this Older Women's Network conference, and I'm very sorry indeed not to be with you on the shores of Sydney Harbour. But from the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, where I work, I think I can just hear the roar of older women in Australia. For roar we must. As older women, we've been ignored, passed over, put down and made invisible for far too long. Thank you for creating this network. You have my full support. Well, I'm currently a United Nations Assistant Secretary General working with the UN Refugee Agency over the last 4 years. Well, Oscar Wilde is said to have said, "If a woman tells you her age, she'll tell you anything." Well, this year I'm 78 years old and possibly one of the oldest people in a position such as mine. But sadly, I will retire at Christmas and with my husband will return to Melbourne to pick up the threads of our lives in Australia. I hope to have time then for reflection on my professional world and on all the joys and pitfalls of the last 5 decades since I was admitted to legal practice in 1969. I'd like to take the opportunity of this conference to speak about the challenges for older women and the many impediments women of my generation have faced. But I'd also like to move very quickly and more positively to discuss how we can, by working together, use our advocacy and our action to improve the position of our sisters in the future. The impediments for women, and impediments for older women in particular, are well known to you all. It is especially distressing to see how the socio-economic situation of older women has declined in recent years, reversing an earlier trend to improvement in gender equality. Older women, of course, suffered disproportionately from the impacts of COVID-19, particularly those with a disability or with underlying health conditions. Older women are very vulnerable to the impacts of economic inflation or downturns. The World Health Organization reports that 1 in 10 older people suffer from some kind of abuse, neglect or violence. Many older women are subject to stereotyping as being too old, too fragile, often with limited disabilities. They're denied access to work, refused rental accommodation. They can have trouble having access to higher education, to health, particularly mental health care, and even impediments such as unfair and excessive travel insurance. In summary, and sadly, on the Global Index of Progress in Women's Rights, older Australian women are falling further and further behind. To turn to the international environment where I am working, my job with the Refugee Agency is protection of the women and girls, boys and men who've been forced to flee their homes together with their countries or across national boundaries. The world appears to be on fire at the moment, with growing numbers of conflicts and mounting numbers of people forcibly displaced from their homes. At the moment, we are reporting 110 million people forcibly displaced globally, most of them by conflict, but also by poverty, discrimination, persecution, natural disasters, and by the cumulative impacts of climate change. The conflicts will be well known to you. The traditional war, if one can put it that way, in Ukraine, with the more than 8 million people moving across national boundaries to find safety in Europe and other parts of the world. But we also have civil violence in a long-standing conflict in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen. In Africa, we've had 8 military coups in 3 years, the most recent in Gabon, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the recent and very troubling coup in Niger. We've seen 1 million new refugees in the what is now close to a civil war in Sudan, and internal displacement of nearly 1 million in Mozambique. And of course we have the military coup more than 5 years ago and increased violence in Myanmar, leading to over 1 million Rohingya fleeing to safety in a host country, a neighbouring host country, Bangladesh. One of the elements of these tragedies is that older women are particularly affected. Fleeing the war in Ukraine, I stood at the border of Poland and Ukraine on 2 separate missions, watching older women struggling across the border with often their grandchildren or their neighbours' children, seeking safety. It's one of those little details that one recalls, I think, but I remember that these older, poorer women didn't have posh suitcases. They certainly weren't coming in cars. They were arriving by buses or they were walking. They didn't have luggage. They had plastic bin bags in which their possessions were being held, clutching the children's toys as they pulled them across the border to safety. These are the realities, for as we know, the men have been required to stay and fight. Very often the mothers of these children have tried to keep a family going in Ukraine itself. But we also have much less known conflicts, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we have 6.5 million people forcibly displaced, either within the country or refugees coming from other troubled parts of Africa into the Congo. Here again, older women are in the camps, in the refugee camps, trying to care for their children, trying to care for grandchildren who in some cases have lost their parents. Tragically also, they have little or no food. And when I was last on mission to North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I spent quite a lot of time with older women who would tell me, when I asked them how the UN Refugee Agency could best help them as refugees and displaced people, they came back to the issue of food. They have no food, and that has led, of course, to massive spikes in gender-based violence and spikes in child marriages and in young girls engaged in transactional sex. Well, these are the well-documented impacts of conflict and of persecution and violence, but especially on the lives of older women. But it is, I hope, useful to focus on what in the future we can do to ensure that your roar is heard and that we can somehow stimulate a more meaningful legal policy and practical change for the next generation of women. And one point that I wanted to pick up on was the element of the invisibility of older women. And I'm sure many of you will smile wistfully at this phenomenon. We might all recognize this from Virginia Woolf's wonderful novel, Mrs. Dalloway, who, when considering her place among the people she knows, she observed, "Often now this body she wore, this body with its capacities, seemed nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown." Virginia Woolf recalls that she is known only by her husband's name, and she thinks that sometimes it's simply by their gloves and shoes that women are identified. Well, visibility is something that has become of increasing interest to me, partly for over the decades. I've been receiving a cartoon printed on greeting cards, published many decades ago by Punch magazine. And what it depicts is the following. There is a woman called Dr. Triggs who is sitting in a meeting room, a conference room, with all men. Very, very typical for my generation in the workforce. The chair of the meeting is a male, and he says in the cartoon, "That's an excellent suggestion, Dr. Triggs. Perhaps a male member of the committee will care to make it." Well, I've seen this card hundreds of times. Friends send it to me from all over the world because they find it in bookshops and think that I might be particularly amused by it. But of course, it makes a very particular point. How often do we find that our ideas are taken up by men who, it seems, have a greater level of credibility? So how can women be more visible in making their ideas clear? And I think one way is by speaking up. Speaking up in the responsible media, by writing an opinion piece for social media or for your gardening club, for the school council. Fine journalism is impactful, and we've seen that by I have to say, in the international environment, the number of Australian women who are journalists and are making their views better known. It might be that we can achieve that visibility through action groups, but I do stress that in trying to be visible, we need to get our facts right, to be well informed, to make measured judgments, and to make constructive proposals. We should never sink to the level of vitriol that we read or hear in social media. Of course, we have seen some very interesting changes in Australia, although I've only been following this from a distance. But one is women stepping up more frequently as leaders. And not every woman, and particularly older woman, is going to want to do that, but many will. And we've seen the impact of women at the political level in the last election in Australia. And I hope that this inspires others, both to stand for election, but also to lead in every aspect of society, to work to ensure equal pay and opportunities, and to ensure in particular that older women have a place in their local communities, that they can be effective through faith groups, through education, and in the health sectors. The women, of course, can step up as leaders and do in the humanitarian sphere, and I do see that within the United Nations humanitarian system, because they tend to dominate in many of the leading agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the UN Women for obvious reasons, UNICEF, and other agencies, such as the World Food Programme, World Health Organization. They are organizations where women can play a very strong role. It's true that for the most part they are led by men, but I think it's time for a change. It's time to see those women at more senior positions in the UN system coming up to run their agencies and to have a much more public role. It's time, of course, for a woman to be a UN Secretary General. We have never had one, and it's time that we started to lobby to get women into senior positions of that kind, where the visibility is clear and where their voice is heard. Of course, we should never forget the women, and very often the older women, who actually do so much of the hard work behind the scenes. And one memory I have in particular was speaking at an event in Sydney about the rights of refugees and the very sad environment in which so many of them were held in detention centres in various facilities around Australia, but in my case in particular, I'd just been to the Villawood prison and to the detention centre for refugees, where people have been held for many months and in many cases more than 1 or 2 years. But I remember giving the speech and then leaving the meeting, and as I came down in the lift, I met a group of women who had come to hear the speech, but who had been going every week to the Villawood prison and detention centres to bring books and clothes and food to the men, women and children who were there, little known and little understood by the rest of Australia. These women were not big names, they weren't people you would see in the newspapers, but they were the heart and soul, really, of the community response to the plight of refugees who'd come to Australia without visas. These women were not looking for applause. They just quietly did their work and did so at that particular detention facility far more frequently than I was ever able to do in practice. So we need to recognise that role and to support them. Well, a primary task, of course, for the Older Women's Network is to advocate for the legal and enforceable rights of older people. And I have two advocacy suggestions, one for our law in Australia, but the other for the public international law world in which I currently work. The first concerns our own law in Australia. Australia is the only common law country without a Charter of Human Rights, either as part of our constitution or our national legislation. It is an extraordinary, unique position, really, for Australia within the common law system. I know that at the moment Australians are considering the question as to whether or not a referendum should be held to recognise the voice of Indigenous Australians, and I can say personally that I hope that voice will be recognised. And for the moment, I think the attempts to achieve a charter to include the rights of older people has to remain a political objective in the future once we get past the current process for a voice. But I do think that it's something that older women can stand up for. We have a better chance, and I say this as a lawyer, as an international lawyer, we have a better chance of protecting the rights of older women if we have those rights included in a Charter of Human Rights. That would, I think, probably in the first instance be national legislation and might, in the longer term, be approved as part of the Constitution. But a realistic ambition would be to have legislation creating a Charter of Human Rights that would include the rights of older people. And that would then give our courts and tribunals a legal foundation to ensure adequate protection for older people and for older women, for access to adequate housing, to an adequate standard of living, to achieve the independence and autonomy that they are entitled to, and of course to quality healthcare and mental health care. So I think that's one practical suggestion that I would make for that advocacy to bring together women across Australia to support the rights of older women through some form of legislative Charter of Rights. But the second suggestion is that there needs to be some form of international convention that protects the rights of older people. There is a very real gap, I'd suggest, in international human rights law. I deal as part of my job, of course, with the Refugee Convention, but also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CEDAW Convention on the Rights of Women generally, various other rights in relation to trafficking and torture, and the general human rights provisions, civil and political rights and economic and social rights, all that body of law created in the last century. But one very notable gap is that we don't have any international convention that particularly recognises the rights of older people. And I think that this is something that would really advance the capacity for advocacy, for visibility of the rights of older women, and to make it easier for national courts, tribunals, and social bodies to include older women and to recognise them as having very special needs. So I think that this is something perhaps that many people might not feel comfortable talking about if they're not perhaps conversant with the international legal environment, but I know many of you will be. And I think Susan Ryan's work, and many of you will remember the quite remarkable Susan Ryan. She was, of course, a commissioner for older people and older people's rights during my term as president of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I know that she was brave enough to attempt to get a convention on the rights of older people during her term. And I would very much like to see older women support that initiative and take it forward for the next generation. It is clear that older people, as a matter of law, have the same rights to life and health as everyone else. The COVID pandemic, to which so many older people succumb, stimulated another development that I'd like to mention, which is the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, policy brief on 2020 pledges to respect the dignity and rights of older people. And that was followed in October 2021 by the Human Rights Council's call for nations to prohibit discrimination against older people and to eliminate ageism. So if we don't yet have a convention on the rights of older people, we at least have now the development of some policy briefs within the UN system that can help to elevate the issue, to give greater visibility to the plight of older people that sadly, of course, COVID did. Well, these advocacy ideas mightn't suit you. I merely offer them as some ideas, but you might very well have local community interests in older people, the need for healthcare, for example, where you might want to advocate at a much more local and national level. So, and if you do, I'm very, very keen to support you in any of these initiatives. So I very much look forward to hearing about your discussions in this conference. I wish you every success. And I'd like to conclude, if I may, by misquoting that great boxing champion, Muhammad Ali. May older women roar like a lion and purr like a cat. So best of luck to you all, and thank you.